In the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, two military machines collided in what would become the deadliest conflict in human history. But here's the shocking truth most people get wrong. The German Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union in 1941 with what seemed like an unstoppable advantage, boasting superior tactics, battle-hardened troops fresh from conquering most of Europe, and the revolutionary blitzkrieg doctrine that had crushed Poland in weeks and France in months. Their panzer divisions were faster, their communication systems more advanced, and their officers had something the Soviets desperately lacked at first: actual combat experience against modern armies. But here's where it gets insane. The Red Army had one thing that would ultimately matter more than anything else: sheer overwhelming numbers and an industrial capacity that would grow to absolutely dwarf Germany's. We're talking about a nation that could lose 1 million men and still keep fighting, that could relocate entire factories brick by brick beyond the Ural Mountains while being invaded, that could produce tanks at a rate that made German generals physically sick when they saw the intelligence reports. The T-34 alone, a tank designed by pure Soviet engineering genius, was being manufactured at over 1,000 per month by 1943, while Germany struggled to make 100 Panthers. And get this, Soviet artillery, the so-called God of War, outnumbered German guns by ratios that sometimes reached 5-to-1. But raw numbers don't tell the whole story, because German tactical superiority was real. Their NCOs could make decisions on the fly, while Soviet units often waited for orders from above. German infantry squads were built around the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon so devastating it could fire 1,200 rounds per minute and psychologically break enemy formations just with its sound. Meanwhile, Soviet squads in the early war were undertrained, under-equipped, and often sent into battle without enough rifles to go around. Yet somehow, impossibly, the tide turned. And here's the part that starts revealing the real answer to our question. By 1943, the Soviet military had evolved into something absolutely terrifying. They'd learned from their catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942, where entire army groups were encircled and destroyed, where millions surrendered or died in the opening months. And they promoted competent generals like Georgy Zhukov, who had stopped the Germans at Moscow, Konstantin Rokossovsky, who would orchestrate some of the war's most devastating offensives, and even Konev, who would race to Berlin. These weren't the same commanders who'd been purged by Stalin in the late 1930s, when he executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of experienced officers in paranoid rampages that nearly destroyed the Red Armies. Leadership before the war even started. No, these were survivors, learners, men who understood that the old Soviet doctrine had failed and needed radical transformation. And transform they did, mastering what they called deep battle operations, or deep operations, a concept that made the German blitzkrieg look like a simple smash and grab. Deep operations involved coordinating massive offensives across hundreds of miles, punching through enemy lines, not just to encircle one army, but to destroy entire army groups, to unhinge the enemy's entire defensive structure. And the Soviets proved they could do this with Operation Bagration in June 1944, timed to coincide with the Western Allies' D-Day landings. This operation was named after a Georgian general who'd fought Napoleon, and it would see the Red Army destroy Germany's Army Group Center. We're talking about over 400,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, in a single coordinated offensive that lasted just 2 months. The Germans lost more men in Bagration than they did at Stalingrad. But nobody in the West talks about it, because D-Day happened at the same time and captured all the attention. But here's what made Bagration so devastating. It wasn't just the numbers. It was the deception, the coordination, the sheer operational brilliance. The Soviets had learned to conduct maskirovka, military deception, on a scale the Germans couldn't counter. They built fake tank armies with wooden vehicles, ran radio traffic from units that didn't exist, and meanwhile moved their real forces into position under complete radio silence and at night. When the offensives began, the Germans were hit in places they never expected, with force levels they couldn't comprehend. Soviet artillery barrages involved thousands of guns firing simultaneously, creating a rolling barrage that moved forward like a wall of death. And behind it came waves of T-34 tanks, not the most sophisticated tanks in the world, but reliable, easily repaired, with wide tracks that could handle Russian mud and winter snow in ways German tanks never could. Something wild. The Soviets had also developed specialized breakthrough divisions, units specifically designed to punch holes in German defensive lines. These weren't just regular rifle divisions. They were loaded with extra artillery, extra engineers with flamethrowers and explosives, extra tanks and self-propelled guns. Their entire purpose was to create the breach that exploitation forces would then pour through. And this is where Soviet operational art became truly sophisticated. Because once the breach was made, they'd send through their tank armies, not tank divisions, mind you, but entire armies of mechanized forces, thousands of tanks and motorized infantry that would drive deep into the German rear, cutting supply lines, surrounding entire formations, creating chaos that German commanders couldn't respond to because their forces were already stretched impossibly thin, fighting a war on multiple fronts. But let's rewind and talk about how we got here. Because in 1941, the situation was completely different. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, it was the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and other Axis forces, smashed across the Soviet border in a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And the results were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in massive Kesselschlacht battles, the battles of encirclement that were the pinnacle of German operational doctrine. At Kiev alone, the Germans captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. At Minsk and Smolensk, hundreds of thousands more. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority almost immediately, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft, many of them caught on the ground in the first hours of the invasion. Soviet tank forces, despite having more tanks than the Germans, including models like the KV-1 and T-34 that were superior to most German tanks, were squandered in piecemeal counterattacks, used without proper infantry support, without air cover, without adequate supply and logistics, because the Soviet officer corps had been gutted by Stalin's purges, and the remaining officers often didn't know how to employ combined arms tactics effectively. Meanwhile, German combined arms integration was superb. Their panzer divisions worked in close coordination with Luftwaffe close air support, particularly the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which became a symbol of blitzkrieg terror. Their infantry divisions were trained to exploit breakthroughs created by armor, and their entire operational system was based on Auftragstactic, mission-type tactics, where junior officers and even NCOs were empowered to use initiative to accomplish objectives rather than waiting for orders. This gave German forces a flexibility and responsiveness that Soviet forces initially couldn't match. But here's where the German advantage started to erode. First, the distances involved in the Soviet Union were unlike anything Germany had faced in Western Europe. Hundreds of miles into enemy territory, and their supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. German trucks were breaking down on terrible Soviet roads. The famous Russian mud, the Rasputitsa, would immobilize entire armies twice a year during spring thaw and autumn rains. And when winter came, the Germans discovered their equipment wasn't designed for temperatures that dropped to -40°C. Tanks wouldn't start. Weapons froze. Soldiers suffered frostbite in the hundreds of thousands because they lacked proper winter clothing. Meanwhile, Soviet equipment was designed for these conditions. The T-34's diesel engine would start in cold that killed German gasoline engines. Soviet soldiers had winter gear, and the Soviet population was accustomed to the brutal climate. Second, and this is crucial, the Soviets had strategic depth. They could retreat hundreds of miles and still be fighting on their own territory. They could trade space for time in a way that no other nation, Germany, had fought, could do. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, the Russians had retreated all the way to Moscow and burned it, rather than let Napoleon have it. And eventually, the Grande Armée destroyed itself in the vastness of Russia. Now, 129 years later, the same geography was working against another invader. Third, the Soviet economy, while it seemed backwards compared to Germany's, was actually more capable of total war mobilization. Stalin had industrialized the Soviet Union through brutal 5-year plans in the 1930s. Yes, millions had died in the process. Yes, the human cost was horrific. But the result was that the USSR had an industrial base spread across an enormous territory. And when the Germans invaded, Soviet authorities began the largest industrial evacuation in history, moving over 1,500 factories from the war zone to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, where German forces could never reach them. Entire tank plants were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and reassembled in Siberia and Central Asia. Workers and their families went with them, and within months these factories were producing again. By 1942, Soviet war production was outpacing Germany. By 1943, it was overwhelming Germany. The numbers are staggering. The Soviet Union produced over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war, compared to Germany's roughly 67,000. They produced over 157,000 aircraft, compared to Germany's 119,000. And in artillery, the gap was even more dramatic. The Soviets produced over 500,000 artillery pieces of all types, while Germany produced around 160,000. But it wasn't just quantity. Soviet designs were often brilliant in their simplicity and effectiveness. The T-34 medium tank is the perfect example. It had sloped armor that was more effective than thicker flat armor on German tanks. It had a powerful 76mm gun, later upgraded to an 85mm. It had wide tracks for mobility in snow and mud, and it was designed to be produced quickly and maintained easily. A T-34 could be manufactured in a fraction of the time it took to build a German Panther or Tiger. And while German tanks might have been more sophisticated, with better optics and more comfortable crew conditions, when you're producing 5 T-34s for every Panther, sophistication matters less than numbers. The same philosophy applied to other Soviet weapons. Submachine gun could be stamped out of metal sheets quickly and cheaply. It held 71 rounds in its drum magazine, and it was devastatingly effective in close combat. Soviet artillery came in every size, from mortars to massive 203mm howitzers, and they developed the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, trucks or tanks fitted with racks of rockets that could saturate an area with explosives. The Germans called them Stalin's organs because of the terrible shrieking sound the rockets made, and they feared them. But numbers and equipment only tell part of the story. The real transformation was in Soviet operational and tactical competence. After the disasters of 1941, desperate defensive battles of 1942, including Stalingrad, where the Red Army finally stopped the Germans and then encircled and destroyed an entire German army, Soviet commanders and staff officers had learned hard lessons about modern warfare. They studied German tactics and adapted them. They developed their own innovations. They became masters of deception and surprise. They learned to coordinate artillery, armor, infantry, and air power in ways that eventually exceeded German capabilities. And they had advantages the Germans couldn't match. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines were tying down entire divisions, destroying supply trains, killing collaborators, making it impossible for the Germans to pacify occupied territory. Soviet intelligence from spy networks like the Red Orchestra, and from Britain sharing ultra-decrypts, gave them insights into German plans. And perhaps most importantly, Soviet morale and motivation evolved. Yes, the initial invasion had been a shock. Yes, millions of Soviet soldiers had surrendered in 1941, often because they saw no point in dying for Stalin's regime. But as German atrocities became known, as Nazi ideology's vision for Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, to be enslaved or exterminated, became clear, Soviet resistance stiffened. This was now a war of survival, a great patriotic war, as Soviet propaganda called it, invoking Russian nationalism alongside communist ideology. Soldiers fought not just for Stalin, but for their families, their homes, their very existence, and this gave them a motivation that German soldiers increasingly lacked as the war turned against them. By 1944, when Soviet forces were liberating their own territory and pushing into Eastern Europe, Red Army soldiers were often fighting with a fury driven by what they'd witnessed. They'd seen their cities destroyed, their civilians murdered, they'd liberated death camps and seen the industrial scale of Nazi genocide, and they were coming for revenge. The discipline that had held some Soviet units back early in the war gave way to a controlled fury that made them terrifying opponents. Meanwhile, forces were increasingly exhausted. Their best units had been ground down in years of combat. Replacements were younger and less trained. Fuel shortages meant tanks couldn't maneuver. Ammunition was rationed. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies by superior numbers of Soviet aircraft and better-trained Soviet pilots, and German soldiers knew they were fighting a losing war, but were trapped between Allied armies advancing from the west and Soviet armies rolling in from the east. So who was stronger? If we freeze the moment at June 1941, Germany was stronger in every meaningful way except raw size. They had better tactics, better training, better equipment integration, more combat experience, better logistics, better command and control. They were a professional military machine that had conquered most of Europe. But military strength isn't static, it's dynamic. It exists in time and context. And in the context of total war from 1941 to 1945, the Soviet Union proved stronger, because they could absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting, because they could outproduce their enemy, because they could learn and adapt, because they had strategic depth and resources Germany couldn't match. By 1945, the Red Army fielded over 300 divisions. They had tank armies that dwarfed anything the Germans could field. They had air superiority. They had mastered operational warfare at a level that possibly exceeded any military in history. They had generals who'd survived the crucible of the Eastern Front and learned to orchestrate battles involving millions of men across thousands of miles. The final answer is this: Germany's Wehrmacht in 1941 was like a perfectly forged sword, sharp, deadly, but ultimately brittle. The Soviet Red Army was like a massive sledgehammer, crude at first, but growing more refined with each battle. And when you strike a sword with a sledgehammer enough times, the sword breaks. That's what happened on the Eastern Front. The German military broke itself against Soviet resistance, Soviet space, Soviet winter, Soviet production, and Soviet adaptation. By the time Soviet forces were raising the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945, there was no question who had been stronger. The nation that could sustain total war, that could transform its entire society into a war machine, that could sacrifice millions and still achieve victory. That was the stronger power, and that was the Soviet Union. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union lost somewhere between 25 and 27 million people in the war, more than any other nation. But they won, and in winning they proved that in total war between industrial powers, the nation with greater resources, greater production capacity, greater population, and yes, the willingness to pay any price for victory, that nation will prevail. The German Wehrmacht was an extraordinary fighting force, perhaps the most tactically proficient army of the 20th century at its peak. But the Red Army became something else entirely. They became an unstoppable force that would reshape Europe and emerge as one of the two superpowers of the post-war world. So the answer to who is stronger isn't simple. It depends on when you ask. But by the end, by the only measure that matters in war, which is who won, the Soviet army was stronger, and the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht, surrendering by the millions in 1945, were the proof.